Prolonged sitting changes the brain in ways that are almost invisible at first, which is why it is so often underestimated. There is no sharp pain, no immediate confusion, no clear signal that something is wrong. The brain simply adapts, quietly and efficiently, to a body that is no longer moving as much. When sitting becomes the dominant posture for hours each day, blood flow patterns shift. Gravity pulls more blood toward the lower body, and the subtle pressure changes created by standing and walking begin to disappear. The brain still receives blood, but not with the same richness or rhythm it once did, and over time this difference begins to matter. The brain is one of the most energy-demanding organs in the body. It relies on a constant, well-regulated supply of oxygen and nutrients to maintain attention, memory, and emotional balance. When circulation is slightly reduced for long periods, neurons do not fail dramatically, but they become less efficient. Signals travel a little slower. Connections are maintained with less enthusiasm. The brain compensates by conserving energy, lowering its baseline level of alertness. This conservation feels like mental fatigue, slower recall, or reduced motivation, and it is often mistaken for normal aging rather than a response to prolonged stillness. What makes this process particularly subtle is that the brain is excellent at adapting to its environment. When movement decreases, the brain interprets this as a sign that high alertness is no longer required. It reduces stimulation accordingly. This is not damage, but adaptation. The problem arises when this adapted state becomes permanent. Day after day of extended sitting trains the brain to expect low demand. Over months and years, this expectation reshapes neural activity patterns, gradually dulling responsiveness. Blood vessels in the brain are also affected by prolonged sitting. Healthy vessels respond to changes in pressure and flow by expanding and contracting. This flexibility helps regulate blood delivery precisely where it is needed. When movement is limited, these fluctuations become less frequent. Vessels receive fewer signals to adapt. Over time, they may become less responsive, increasing resistance and further reducing efficient blood flow. Again, this happens slowly and without symptoms that would trigger alarm. The quiet nature of this process is what makes it dangerous. Because the changes are gradual, they are often attributed entirely to age. Memory lapses, reduced focus, and slower thinking are accepted as inevitable, when in reality they are influenced by how much the body moves throughout the day. Sitting too long does not attack the brain aggressively. It simply deprives it of the stimulation it evolved to expect. The brain's relationship with movement is ancient. Human cognition developed in bodies that walked, climbed, shifted, and rested in cycles. Stillness existed, but it was temporary. Modern sitting, especially uninterrupted sitting, is biologically unfamiliar. When the brain encounters this unfamiliar pattern repeatedly, it adjusts as best it can, even if the adjustment is not optimal for long-term vitality. For older adults, this adaptation is more pronounced because recovery capacity is reduced. The brain can still respond positively to change, but it requires clearer signals. Prolonged sitting sends a powerful signal of inactivity. Without interruption, this signal dominates the brain's interpretation of the body's needs. Awareness of this process is the first step toward change. Recognizing that mental dullness may be influenced by posture and movement opens the door to gentle correction rather than resignation. Understanding that sitting ages the brain quietly allows us to shift from blaming age to examining habits. It reframes cognitive decline not as an unavoidable loss, but as a modifiable response to environmental signals. The brain remains plastic well into later life. It listens constantly to the body. When the body stays still too long, the brain follows. When movement returns, even gently, the brain begins to respond again, restoring some of the vitality that seemed to have faded not because it was lost, but because it had been waiting for a different message to arrive. The brain depends on the body for nourishment in ways that extend far beyond food and oxygen intake alone. It relies on motion to shape how blood is delivered, how pressure is regulated, and how resources are distributed moment by moment. When the body moves, even gently, circulation becomes dynamic. Blood shifts, pressure changes, and vessels respond. These fluctuations are not noise in the system, they are signals the brain depends on to stay alert and well supplied. Sitting for long periods flattens this dynamic landscape, and the brain begins operating in a more limited circulatory environment. When a person stands or walks, Muscles in the legs and torso assist the return of blood toward the heart. This assistance improves overall circulation and helps maintain steady blood flow to the brain. Sitting removes much of this support. Blood pools more easily in the lower body, and the heart must work against a less cooperative system. The result is not a dramatic drop in cerebral blood flow, but a subtle reduction in efficiency. Over time, the brain receives blood that is slightly slower, slightly less responsive to changing demands. Posture also plays a role. Sitting, especially with a rounded spine or compressed neck, can influence how blood travels through major vessels that supply the brain. Small changes in vessel angle or pressure may not cause immediate problems, but over years they contribute to less optimal delivery. The brain adapts by prioritizing essential functions and reducing activity in areas associated with focus, creativity, and rapid processing. This prioritization feels like mental slowing, even though the brain is still working hard to maintain balance. Movement creates pulses of demand. When muscles contract, they signal the cardiovascular system to adjust. Blood is redirected. Vessels dilate where needed. The brain benefits from this responsiveness. It receives richer input and clearer signals about the body's state. Sitting removes these pulses. Demand becomes flat and predictable. The cardiovascular system settles into a maintenance mode. The brain, sensing stability rather than challenge, reduces its level of engagement. This reduction is not a failure of the brain. It is a reasonable response to the information it receives. If the body appears inactive for hours at a time, the brain assumes high alertness is unnecessary. Over days and weeks, this assumption becomes habitual. The brain's baseline state shifts toward lower stimulation. Tasks that once felt easy now require more effort. Attention wanders more quickly. These changes are often subtle, but they accumulate. Older adults are particularly sensitive to this shift because vascular flexibility naturally decreases with age. Blood vessels still adapt, but they need stronger signals to do so. Movement provides those signals. Sitting removes them. The brain's dependence on whole-body movement becomes more apparent as age advances, not because the brain weakens, but because the margin for inefficiency narrows. It is important to understand that mental activity alone does not fully compensate for physical stillness. Reading, thinking, or engaging in conversation stimulates the brain cognitively, but it does not recreate the circulatory dynamics produced by movement. The brain evolved to integrate cognitive effort with physical motion. Separating the two for long periods creates an imbalance. The brain receives information but lacks the circulatory support that helps process it efficiently. Restoring movement restores this partnership. Standing up changes blood distribution immediately. Walking introduces rhythm. Shifting posture alters pressure. Each of these actions sends information to the brain that demand is returning. Blood flow adjusts. Oxygen delivery improves. The brain responds by increasing alertness and responsiveness. This does not require intense exercise. It requires variation. Understanding that the brain depends on whole-body movement reframes sitting as more than a comfort issue. It becomes a circulatory and neurological factor that shapes how the brain ages. When sitting dominates the day, the brain adapts downward. When movement is reintroduced regularly, the brain adapts upward, not because it is being forced to work harder, but because it is finally receiving the signals it has always depended on to stay nourished, responsive, and alive to the body it serves. Muscles are often thought of as tools for movement, but biologically they are also powerful communicators, constantly sending information to the brain about the state of the body. Every time a muscle contracts, it releases a cascade of chemical messengers into the bloodstream. These signals influence how the brain regulates blood flow, inflammation, energy use, and even mood. When muscles are active, the brain receives a steady stream of feedback that says the body is engaged, responsive, and alive. When sitting dominates the day, that stream slows to a trickle. This loss of chemical communication has subtle but meaningful effects on brain health. Muscle contractions release substances that support neuron survival, encourage the growth of new connections, and help maintain healthy blood vessels in the brain. These messengers evolved as part of a feedback loop, where movement informs the brain and the brain adjusts the body in return. When muscles remain inactive for long periods, the brain is deprived of these signals. It does not interpret this as danger, but as a reduced need for alertness and adaptability. Over time, the absence of muscular signaling changes how the brain allocates resources. Areas responsible for quick decision-making, memory formation, and emotional regulation become less stimulated. This does not mean neurons are dying rapidly, but it does mean they are operating in a quieter environment. Connections that are used less frequently become weaker. Neural pathways that depend on movement-related feedback lose some of their clarity. The brain becomes efficient in stillness, but less responsive in motion and thought. This process is especially relevant for older adults because the brain becomes more dependent on supportive signals with age. Recovery from stress takes longer. Blood vessels respond more slowly. Chemical messengers from muscles help counterbalance these changes by promoting circulation and reducing inflammation. When sitting replaces movement, this protective influence diminishes. The brain is left managing age-related changes without one of its most reliable allies. What is striking is how quickly these signals can return. Even gentle muscle activation releases beneficial messengers. Slow leg movements, standing up, or shifting weight activate muscle fibers enough to restart communication. The brain responds not to the intensity of the movement, but to the fact that movement is occurring at all. This is why small actions can have outsized effects on mental clarity and mood. Mental activity alone does not replace this chemical dialogue. Thinking, reading, or concentrating stimulates neural circuits, but it does not generate the same biochemical environment as muscle contraction. The brain evolved in a body that moved while thinking. Separating cognition from movement for long periods creates a mismatch. The brain receives information without the supporting signals that help process it efficiently. This mismatch contributes to the sense of mental fog that many older adults experience after long periods of sitting. It is not simply fatigue. It is a biochemical quieting. The brain is functioning in a low-signal environment. When movement is reintroduced, even briefly, many people notice an immediate change. Thoughts feel clearer. Mood lifts slightly. Attention sharpens. These shifts reflect the return of muscle-derived messages. The relationship between muscles and the brain is reciprocal. When the brain receives more signals from active muscles, it sends stronger signals back. Coordination improves. Balance stabilizes. Confidence in movement increases. This encourages more activity, reinforcing the cycle. When muscles remain inactive, the opposite occurs. The brain sends fewer signals. Movement feels less natural. Stillness becomes the default. Understanding muscles as messengers rather than mere movers changes how we think about sitting. Prolonged sitting silences a conversation the brain relies on to maintain vitality. It is not that the brain forgets how to think, but that it lacks the chemical context that supports sharpness and adaptability. Restoring that context does not require effortful exercise, only regular reminders that the body is still participating. For older adults, this perspective is empowering. It means that supporting brain health is not limited to mental exercises or complex routines. It can begin with acknowledging that muscles have something important to say, and giving them frequent opportunities to speak. When movement returns in small, consistent ways, the brain listens, adjusts, and responds by reawakening pathways that had grown quiet not from damage, but from disuse and reduced signaling that was never meant to last uninterrupted through long hours of stillness. The brain is not only an organ of thought, but an organ of rhythm, responding constantly to patterns in the body and the environment. One of the most important rhythms it listens to is the gentle fluctuation of blood flow created by regular movement. When the body moves, blood does not simply travel faster, it travels with variation, responding to muscle contractions, posture changes, and shifts in pressure. These variations nourish the brain in a way that steady, unchanging flow cannot. Prolonged sitting creates a form of circulatory monotony. Blood continues to reach the brain, but the dynamic changes that stimulate vascular flexibility are reduced. Over time, blood vessels adapt to this predictability. They become less responsive, less elastic. The brain, which depends on rapid adjustments in blood flow to support thinking, memory, and emotional balance, begins operating in a narrower range of conditions. This does not cause immediate damage, but it slowly limits the brain's ability to respond to sudden demands. In younger bodies, blood vessels often recover quickly from periods of stillness. With age, this flexibility becomes harder to maintain. Movement acts as a daily reminder to the vascular system that adaptability is still required. Each time a person stands, walks, or shifts position, small muscles contract and relax, creating waves of pressure that travel through the arteries. These waves stimulate the inner lining of blood vessels, encouraging the release of substances that keep them supple and responsive. When sitting dominates the day, this stimulation is reduced. The vessels still function, but they operate on a simpler pattern. Over months and years, this can contribute to reduced efficiency in delivering oxygen and nutrients to active brain regions. Areas involved in focus and memory may receive slightly less support when they need it most. The brain compensates by working harder, which can feel like mental fatigue or slower thinking. This vascular effect is deeply connected to posture. Sitting for long periods often involves a forward-leaning position that alters blood flow from the heart to the head. Neck muscles tighten. Breathing becomes shallower. These changes further reduce the natural variations in circulation. The brain adapts to this new normal, but at a cost. It becomes accustomed to a narrower range of input, which can limit resilience under stress. Gentle movement interrupts this pattern almost immediately. Standing upright allows gravity to shift blood distribution. Walking introduces rhythmic pressure changes with each step. Even simple actions like stretching or rotating the shoulders influence circulation to the brain. These movements do not need to be intense. The brain responds to change itself, not to exertion. It senses that the body is dynamic again and adjusts blood flow accordingly. For older adults, this adaptability is especially important because the brain becomes more sensitive to small reductions in circulation. Supporting vascular responsiveness helps preserve cognitive function not by forcing improvement, but by maintaining flexibility. The goal is not to maximize blood flow at all times, but to preserve the brain's ability to adjust flow when needed. This adaptability underlies alertness, emotional regulation, and the capacity to learn new things. There is also a psychological dimension to this process. When movement is reintroduced, many people notice not only clearer thinking, but a subtle sense of presence. This reflects the brain receiving more varied sensory and circulatory input. It feels more awake, not because it is being pushed, but because it is being nourished in a way it recognizes from earlier stages of life. The body was designed to alternate between rest and motion. Sitting itself is not harmful, but uninterrupted sitting disrupts the rhythm the brain expects. By breaking this pattern with regular, gentle movement, the vascular system regains its natural variability. Blood vessels practice responding. The brain receives richer information. Over time, this supports mental clarity not through stimulation, but through restoration of a biological conversation that depends on movement to remain fluent and responsive and alive. The aging brain does not decline simply because time passes, but because communication within the body becomes quieter. One of the most important conversations is the one between movement and the nervous system. When sitting dominates daily life, this dialogue fades, not dramatically, but gradually, until the brain begins to operate with fewer signals about balance, position, and internal state. Reducing sitting time restores this conversation and slows changes that feel like aging but are often the result of underuse. The brain evolved to interpret constant feedback from muscles, joints, and blood vessels. Every shift in posture sends information upward, telling the brain where the body is in space and how resources should be allocated. This feedback sharpens attention and keeps neural networks flexible. Long periods of sitting silence much of this input. The brain receives fewer updates, and over time it becomes less practiced at adjusting to change. This does not mean neurons disappear overnight, but their responsiveness softens. When sitting is interrupted regularly, even briefly, the brain re-engages with its environment. Standing up requires coordination. Taking a few steps challenges balance. Gentle movement stimulates sensory receptors that send rich data to brain regions involved in awareness and planning. These signals reinforce pathways that support adaptability. The brain is reminded that it must stay ready, not just for thought, but for action. This readiness is closely linked to alertness. Many older adults describe mental fog that seems to arrive without cause. Often, it is not a failure of memory but a lack of stimulation through movement. Reducing sitting time increases the frequency of small awakenings in the nervous system. These awakenings do not exhaust the brain. They refresh it. The brain learns that it must respond repeatedly throughout the day, keeping circuits active and engaged. There is also an emotional component. Prolonged stillness can subtly narrow emotional range. Movement influences mood-regulating chemicals and promotes a sense of agency. When a person stands, stretches, or walks, the brain registers action taken, not just thought. This reinforces confidence and motivation, qualities that often fade when days become physically repetitive. By moving more often, older adults support not only cognitive function but emotional resilience. The benefit lies not in intensity but in consistency. Short, frequent breaks from sitting maintain the brain's habit of adjustment. Each transition from sitting to standing requires recalibration. Blood pressure shifts, muscles activate, sensory input changes. These moments act like gentle training sessions for the brain, preserving its ability to respond to unexpected demands. Over time, this reduces vulnerability to stress and supports steadier thinking. Reducing sitting time also protects long-term brain health by maintaining vascular communication. Blood vessels that regularly respond to posture changes remain more elastic. This supports efficient delivery of oxygen and nutrients during cognitive tasks. The brain is less likely to struggle during moments that require focus or quick decisions. This does not guarantee prevention of disease, but it preserves functional reserve, which is the brain's ability to cope with challenges. Perhaps most importantly, standing and moving reinforce a sense of participation in life. The brain thrives when it feels engaged with the body's actions. Movement anchors thought in experience. It keeps time flowing rather than stagnant. Aging then becomes a process of adaptation rather than withdrawal. The brain continues to learn from the body, and the body continues to support the brain. By simply sitting less, older adults give the brain repeated opportunities to practice flexibility. This practice accumulates quietly. It shows up as steadier attention, quicker recovery from fatigue, and a feeling of mental presence. These are not dramatic changes, but meaningful ones. They reflect a brain that is still in conversation with the body, still responsive, still capable of renewal through simple acts of standing, shifting, and moving through space with intention and continuity.